Have you ever felt like you were carrying a weight no one else could see? Not a physical burden, but something deeper. An invisible heaviness that lingers in your chest, clings to your thoughts, and quietly drains your joy. It might be the pain of a lost relationship, the sting of betrayal, or the silent ache of an unfulfilled dream. Maybe it's the endless loop of what if and if only playing in the back of your mind. We carry these things. We drag them through our days, and though we smile and press on, somewhere inside, a part of us is tired. Most of us live our lives gripping tightly to the past and anxiously anticipating the future. We hold on to memories, identities, expectations, and regrets as if they were precious treasures or old scars we refuse to let heal. But what if the true source of our suffering is what happened to us, or what might happen next, but the way we refuse to let go? There's an old story in Zen Buddhism about two monks traveling together. They come across a young woman standing by a muddy riverbank, afraid to cross. Without hesitation, the older monk picks her up and carries her across the water. Later, after miles of silent walking, the younger monk finally blurts out, "We monks are not supposed to touch women, yet you carried her." The older monk simply smiles and says, "I left her by the river hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" That story struck me the first time I heard it, because I realized we're all like that younger monk. We carry things long after they're gone, conversations that ended years ago, failures we survived, people we lost, moments we can't change. And with every extra weight we drag behind us, our steps grow heavier, our hearts a little dimmer. But here's the thing, letting go is not forgetting. It's not pretending it didn't happen. It's not giving up or turning cold. Letting go is the quiet art of setting yourself free. It's choosing peace over pride. It's releasing what you cannot control and finding a strange, unexpected lightness in the space that remains. There's a line by the great Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh that I come back to often. Letting go gives us freedom, and freedom is the only condition for happiness. It sounds simple, but it's one of the hardest things any of us will ever do. Because deep down, we believe that holding on is safer. That if we grip tightly enough to people, to titles, to expectations, we'll somehow protect ourselves from loss, from change, from grief. But life has never worked that way. Everything we love will one day leave us or we them. Every moment will pass, every high will fade, and every pain, if we let it, will soften and dissolve. The Buddhist path teaches us this through two profound truths. Anicca, or impermanence, the understanding that nothing lasts forever. And anatta, or non-self, the idea that what we think of as a fixed me is constantly shifting, never solid, and ultimately empty of a permanent identity. At first, those ideas might feel cold, even terrifying, but look a little deeper and they're not an invitation to despair, they're the doorway to true freedom. Because if nothing is fixed, if nothing can truly be possessed, then nothing has to be clung to. And without clinging, there's no fear of loss. In this space of letting go, something miraculous happens. We begin to experience life more fully, more tenderly. We appreciate beauty without needing to possess it. We love people without trying to own them. We move through pain without getting trapped inside it. The old Zen teachers spoke of the heart as a hand. A clenched fist holds nothing but tension. An open palm, though empty, is full of possibility. So today, I want to invite you to open your palm, to loosen your grip, not to give up, but to give yourself space. In this journey we're about to take together, we'll explore what it truly means to let go, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived, daily practice. We'll uncover the ways clinging hurts us, the wisdom Buddhist philosophy offers, and how modern science quietly agrees. We'll see how love, loss, identity, and freedom are all bound together in this strange, beautiful dance of impermanence. And by the end, my hope is that you'll feel a little lighter. Not because life will have changed, but because you will have. After all, the heaviest things we carry aren't in our hands, they're in our hearts. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to put some of them down. There's a reason the great spiritual traditions of the East have spent centuries teaching the art of letting go. Because long before psychology gave it a name, and long before self-help books lined our shelves, human beings have struggled with attachment. It's as ancient as our first heartbeat. Buddha himself saw this clearly. After years of searching through forests, mountains, and palaces, after witnessing suffering in every form, he discovered a simple, unshakable truth. Suffering arises from attachment, from our unwillingness to accept what is, from clinging to what's pleasant, resisting what's painful, and craving for things to stay the same in a world where nothing does. He called this T a letter 1E47HA macron, a word often translated as craving or thirst. But it's more than just desire. It's a deep, restless ache that convinces us happiness lies just around the corner, just beyond the next achievement, the next relationship, the next escape. And so we chase, we grasp, we build entire identities out of things that cannot last: our youth, our titles, our possessions, our ideas of who we are and how life should be. But the more tightly we cling, the more we suffer. Buddhism doesn't ask us to stop loving, to stop hoping, or to stop dreaming. It asks us to hold those things gently, to love without possessiveness, to hope without expectation, to dream without needing the outcome to define us. The ancient Pali word for letting go is vasaga, a beautiful term meaning to release, to renounce, to give away. But not in the way we often imagine. Letting go doesn't mean we become indifferent, cold, or detached from life's beauty. It means we experience things fully, savor them, and when the time comes, we allow them to pass without grasping. Picture a leaf drifting down a river. You don't stop the current. You don't demand the leaf to stay. You watch it float. You admire its shape and color, and you let it go, knowing it was never yours to keep. This is the wisdom the Buddha pointed to, because clinging, whether to pleasure, to pain, to identities, or to moments, only tightens the knot of suffering within us. And yet, paradoxically, the more we let go, the more alive we become. In the great Buddhist texts, there's a teaching known as the parable of the raft. Buddha once told his disciples, imagine a man comes to a river. He needs to cross to the other shore where safety and peace await. He builds a raft from branches and vines, and with great effort, he paddles across. Once he arrives, does he then pick up the raft, strap it to his back, and carry it through the forest? Or does he leave it by the water's edge, grateful for its service, but knowing its purpose is done? The Buddha's point was simple. Even the things that once saved us, ideas, beliefs, relationships, identities, can become burdens if we refuse to let them go when the time comes. We are so conditioned to cling, to past versions of ourselves, to old wounds that once justified our anger, to stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we deserve. But those stories weigh us down. True freedom isn't found in what we hold on to. It's found in what we release. The Zen master Shunryu Suzuki once said, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few." When we let go of what we think we know, when we loosen our grip on our fixed identities and beliefs, something remarkable happens. Life begins to unfold again. Not as we wish it to be, but as it truly is: fresh, unexpected, infinite in its possibilities. Letting go in the Buddhist sense is not an event. It's a practice, a gentle, daily invitation to unclench the fists of our heart. And the more we practice, the more we realize we lose nothing essential. We don't lose love by releasing control. We don't lose strength by softening our grip. We don't lose meaning by stepping into uncertainty. In fact, we gain everything we thought we lacked: peace, clarity, freedom. The great irony is that everything we try so hard to hold on to is already slipping through our fingers. And in the act of letting go, we don't fall into emptiness. We fall into spaciousness, a place where we can finally breathe again. And so the question isn't whether life will ask you to let go. It will, over and over. The question is, will you meet those moments clinging or open-handed? Because on the other side of letting go isn't loss. It's something far greater. It's the rediscovery of your own unburdened heart. And that's where our path quietly leads next. We like to think we're in control, that if we hold on tightly enough to people, to possessions, to plans, we can stop the inevitable tide of change. It's a tender, very human instinct. And yet, it's also the very thing that makes us ache. Because clinging is not protection, it's a prison. When we cling, what are we really doing? We're trying to freeze a moment in time. To trap life, wild, unpredictable, and alive, into a shape it was never meant to hold. A relationship begins to shift. A career path doesn't unfold as expected. A loved one drifts away. And suddenly the ground beneath us feels unsteady. So we tighten our grip. We replay old conversations. We rehearse imaginary outcomes. We grasp at control where there is none. And in doing so, we suffer, not because life is cruel, but because we refuse to let it flow. Buddha called this attachment one of the primary causes of suffering. But it's not the wanting itself that harms us. It's the inability to let go when the time comes. Think about holding a burning rope. At first, it might seem like the rope is your lifeline. It connects you to what you love, to what you believe you need. But the longer you grip it, the deeper it burns. And the pain isn't in the rope. It's in the grasp. We cling to memories of how things used to be, to ideas of who we once were, to futures we haven't even lived, yet mourn in advance. This clinging turns natural sadness into bitterness. It turns healthy grief into endless suffering. And worst of all, it blinds us to the beauty still present in the here and now. How often have we missed joy, not because it wasn't there, but because we were too busy clutching at something already gone? A friend once told me, "I wish I could be happy, but I can't stop thinking about what I lost." And I understood, because loss is inevitable, but ongoing suffering, that's a choice born from clinging. It happens in subtle ways too. The way we hold expectations over others. The way we demand certainty in an uncertain world. The way we refuse to release grudges, as if punishing ourselves could somehow fix the past. Buddhist wisdom invites us to see that every attachment we form is a tether. And when the winds of life inevitably shift, those tethers pull tight, causing pain. But it doesn't have to. What if we could loosen our grip? Not out of defeat, but out of wisdom. Recognizing that everything changes not as a punishment, but as the nature of things. Leaves fall, tides rise, people grow apart, bodies age. And yet in every ending is the seed of something new. The great Zen poet Ryokan once wrote, "The thief left it behind, the moon at my window." Even when everything is taken, something beautiful remains, but we have to be willing to see it. And we can't see it if we're clinging to what's already gone. Clinging hurts because it traps us in a past we can't change, or a future we can't predict. It distracts us from the only thing we truly have, this moment. And ironically, the tighter we hold, the more we lose. Imagine cupping water in your hands. If you try to clutch it, it slips through your fingers. But if you relax your hands, it rests there, cool and clear. Life is the same. And in those moments we dare to let go, even just a little, we taste a kind of peace that clinging can never offer. A stillness, a clarity, a freedom. Not because everything's perfect, not because we no longer care, but because we've stopped fighting the river. And when we stop fighting, we finally begin to heal. This is why letting go isn't weakness. It's the deepest kind of strength, a courage rooted not in indifference but in wisdom. And it's here in the quiet courage of release that something new stirs, a different way of moving through the world. We're about to touch that place, the space beyond the illusion of control where clarity begins. It sounds simple, doesn't it? Let go, two small words, but in practice, it can feel like trying to loosen a knot that's tied deep inside your chest. Because how do you release something when your heart refuses to let it go? When every instinct tells you to hold on tighter, to fix it, to mend it, to make it stay. The truth is, letting go isn't an event, it's a practice, a daily, quiet choice. Not to sever yourself from life, but to meet it exactly as it is and loosen your grip around what no longer serves you. So how do we begin? The first step is awareness. Most of us don't even realize how tightly we're holding on. We carry old griefs like invisible stones in our pockets. We cling to grudges, expectations, the way we think life should be. So start by noticing. When you feel that knot of resistance, pause. Where in your body do you feel it? In your throat, your chest, your stomach? Name it gently. Here is the ache of attachment. Not to judge it, not to fight it, but to see it. Because awareness is the doorway through which all healing enters. Next, breathe. It sounds too simple maybe, but breath is a bridge between the storm of the mind and the stillness of the present. When your thoughts race, when your heart clenches, when the urge to control rises, pause. Close your eyes. Feel the air entering your body. Notice the way it leaves effortlessly. Life moves, and you can move with it. This is not about pretending not to care or forcing yourself to detach. It's about remembering that you are not the storm. You are the sky, and every feeling, every loss, every craving it passes through. Another practice is gratitude. It may sound strange to be grateful for things you wish had stayed, but gratitude transforms clinging into reverence. Instead of mourning, why did it leave? Whisper softly, thank you for visiting. Thank the relationship that shaped you, the chapter that grew you, the person who taught you something even in their absence. In Buddhism, there's a phrase, this too is a sacred guest. Both joy and sorrow come to your door. Your task is not to chain them down, but to greet them, learn from them, and let them leave when it's time. Another powerful tool is meditation, not as escape, but as presence. Sit with your discomfort. Notice the stories your mind tells. I'll never be whole again. I can't live without this. And gently ask, is this true? Not to erase the feeling, but to see it for what it is. A passing cloud, not the endless sky. Some days it will feel easy, most days it won't. But like any muscle, the more you practice releasing, the more natural it becomes. You'll notice yourself softening in places you once felt armored, choosing peace over control, opening your hands instead of clenching your fists. And sometimes, letting go means simply sitting in the discomfort without trying to fix it, letting the ache be there, trusting that, like all things, it too will shift, because it always does. In Zen, they speak of the 10,000 joys and 10,000 sorrows. Both are part of the path, and to truly live, we must be willing to hold both and eventually release both. You might find it helpful to practice letting go in small ways first. Release a minor irritation. Forgive a casual slight. Surrender your tight grip on how today should unfold. Notice how even tiny releases create space within you. Space where peace can enter. And as you grow more familiar with this space, you'll find yourself ready to release the bigger things. Not all at once, but one gentle breath at a time. Because the truth is, you don't have to let go perfectly. You only have to be willing. willing to unclench your heart, willing to loosen your grip, willing to trust that what is meant for you will stay, and what is meant to leave will open the way for something you can't yet imagine. And perhaps in those quiet, unclenched moments you'll feel it, that lightness, that freedom, the ancient wisdom that says, you were never holding life, it was always holding you. And now, as we step deeper into this understanding, a question begins to emerge. If letting go frees us, then what exactly have we been chasing all this time? We're about to open that door. For centuries, ancient wisdom has whispered to us, let go and you will find peace. But in the world we live in, where science demands evidence and psychology dissects the mind, can these old teachings still hold their weight? Do they survive the bright, clinical glare of modern inquiry? The answer is not only yes, but profoundly so. In fact, what Buddhist monks and sages discovered through silent forests and misty mountaintops, modern science is now confirming with brain scans and clinical studies. Let's start with what happens to your brain when you cling. Psychologists call it attachment distress. It's the stress response triggered when we resist change, loss, or uncertainty. When something we value feels threatened, whether it's a person, a relationship, a dream, or even an identity, the amygdala, the fear center of your brain, fires up. Your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate rises. Your muscles tense. Your thinking narrows. You're no longer responding to life, you're reacting. And chronic clinging, whether to past regrets or future fears, keeps your nervous system in a state of low-grade emergency. It exhausts your immune system, disrupts sleep, increases anxiety and depression. Science tells us, the more we resist what is, the more we suffer. But here's the beautiful part. Letting go, it turns out, has measurable physical benefits. A study from the University of Wisconsin showed that people trained in mindfulness meditation, a practice rooted in non-attachment, had reduced activity in their amygdala, meaning their brains literally became less reactive to stress. Another groundbreaking study published in Psychological Science revealed that people who practiced acceptance of negative emotions, without suppressing or clinging to them, experienced lower levels of anxiety and depression. It wasn't that they felt less pain. It was that pain no longer controlled them. They were learning what the Buddha spoke of over 2,500 years ago. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. Even neuroscience shows us that clinging changes the architecture of the brain. When we obsess over what we can't control, we strengthen the neural pathways of fear, rumination, and craving. It's like rehearsing misery. But when we consciously choose to release, through meditation, reframing, or mindful breathing, we activate regions associated with compassion, resilience, and peace. Functional MRI scans reveal increased activity in the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate, areas responsible for emotional regulation and empathy. In simpler terms, the practice of letting go rewires the brain toward wisdom, and psychology echoes this. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective forms of modern psychotherapy, teaches patients to recognize when they're clinging to irrational beliefs or self-defeating thoughts, and to consciously let them go. Acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, goes even deeper. It helps people detach from their thoughts and emotions, treating them not as absolute truths, but as passing experiences, much like the clouds drifting across a clear sky. Sound familiar? It's the very heart of Buddhist teaching. Even the modern obsession with closure, the idea that we need to tie up every emotional loose end, is being challenged by psychology. Research now shows that peace often comes not from getting answers or control, but from learning to live gracefully with the unknown, to release the demand for certainty, to let go. One study, published in the Journal of Positive Psychology, found that people who intentionally practiced forgiveness, essentially letting go of resentment and grudges, experienced significant drops in stress, anxiety, and even physical symptoms like headaches and fatigue. Another paper from Harvard showed that individuals who cultivated non-attachment to outcomes had higher overall life satisfaction and resilience. They weren't indifferent. They simply refused to let external circumstances define their inner peace. And so, we arrive at this beautiful convergence. What ancient monks discovered in silent meditation, what sages recorded in yellowed scrolls, what the Buddha spoke beneath the Bodhi tree, modern science now confirms with electrodes and peer-reviewed journals that the act of letting go not as resignation but as wisdom changes both the mind and body. It eases suffering, calms the storm, creates space for joy. It turns out, freedom isn't found in clinging tighter. It's in loosening the grip. And perhaps, as both science and spirituality agree, the greatest liberation isn't from our circumstances, but from the way we hold them. So now, we begin to see not only the wisdom in letting go, but the undeniable evidence, which leaves one final, profound question lingering in the air. If letting go brings such peace, what lies on the other side of release? We're about to find out. Love is the most beautiful thing we will ever hold in our hands, and perhaps the hardest thing we'll ever have to release. We all come into this world with open arms. A newborn clings to its mother's finger. A child reaches out for comfort. A lover holds on, hoping this moment, this person, this tenderness might last forever. But life, in its infinite wisdom, reminds us again and again, everything we love is borrowed. Nothing and no one stays. We lose parents to time, friends to distance, lovers to heartbreak. Children grow, moments fade. And every loss carves its mark, some tiny like a scratch on glass, others deep like a canyon in the soul. In those moments when the ache of absence feels unbearable, the natural instinct is to cling harder, to replay old memories, to grip the past with desperate hands, to demand that life reverse itself. But here's the paradox: the tighter we cling, the more we suffer. The Buddha taught this so clearly. Attachment is the root of suffering, not because love is wrong, not because grief is weakness, but because we try to trap what was meant to move. A cherry blossom doesn't cling to the branch. It falls, and in its falling, it completes its purpose. Likewise, when we learn to hold love with open hands, savoring it while it's here, blessing it as it goes, we unlock a kind of freedom most people spend their whole lives chasing. Modern psychology calls this secure attachment, the ability to deeply love without needing to possess. It's not detachment, it's not indifference. It's the courageous choice to love fully, knowing that loss is inevitable, and yet choosing love anyway. The poet Rumi once wrote, "Try not to resist the changes that come your way. Instead, let life live through you." And isn't that what loss teaches us most? That every ending makes space for a new beginning. That the act of letting go isn't the end of love, but its purest expression. We let go, not because we stopped loving, but because we choose to honor the love by setting it free. I once read about a woman who carried her grief like a stone in her pocket. Every morning she would press it to her lips, whisper a name, a memory, a silent plea. Until one day, sitting by the ocean, she realized the stone had grown heavier not because grief grows, but because clinging does. And so she tossed it into the waves, not to forget, not to erase, but to remember differently. To let love become the tide itself. And isn't that what we're asked to do? To love without imprisonment, to grieve without drowning, to remember without chaining ourselves to ghosts. Because the truth is, every great love you've known lives within you. Not in photographs, not in old letters, not in worn-out sweaters or voicemail messages, but here, in the quiet space behind your heartbeat, in the hush of early morning light, in the way you laugh and the tears you carry. Letting go doesn't mean leaving behind. It means carrying differently. It means saying, "Thank you for loving me. Thank you for changing me. Thank you for walking a while with me." And then releasing them to whatever comes next. The Buddhists call it upeksha, a sublime equanimity, a peace so steady it isn't shaken by gain or loss, love or absence. It isn't coldness, it's wisdom. The wisdom to know that love isn't ownership, that loss isn't emptiness, that letting go isn't defeat. It's the highest form of grace. And in that grace, we find what every seeker, every pilgrim, every broken-hearted wanderer has searched for: freedom, not from love, but from the suffering of holding it too tightly. And when we taste that freedom, even for a moment, we realize something extraordinary, that what we release was never leaving us. It was becoming a part of us. And as we gather the wisdom of this journey, one final truth remains. When we let go, what rises in its place is peace. Some journeys don't end where you expect. You set out looking for answers, and somewhere along the way, you find yourself instead. We began this path carrying invisible weights, the fears we wouldn't name, the loves we were afraid to lose, the memories we clung to like lifelines. And yet with each chapter we loosened a finger. We stepped closer to something ancient, something still, something waiting for us beneath the noise of wanting. The Buddha didn't promise us a life without grief. He didn't offer a world where nothing changes, nothing fades, nothing slips through our fingers. What he offered was freedom, not from life, but from the suffering we add to it. Freedom from the desperate clinging to what was. Freedom from the frantic chasing of what might be. Freedom to stand in the center of now, empty-handed and unafraid. We learned that letting go isn't losing. It isn't giving up. It isn't becoming cold or distant. It's loving so deeply that you no longer need to trap to possess, to demand permanence from what was born to be fleeting. It's understanding that every person, every moment, every breath is a wave. And if you chase the wave, you drown. But if you float, if you trust, if you let the wave rise and fall, carrying you wherever it must, you discover you were never separate from the ocean to begin with. This isn't a teaching you memorize. It's a wisdom you live, in every goodbye, in every heartbreak, in every sunrise you witness alone. It's in the silent promise you make to yourself to live wide open, to love without clinging, to release without fear. Because only then can you truly belong to this moment. Only then do you realize you were never meant to hold on so tightly. You were meant to flow. And in that flow is the peace you've always chased. In Buddhist thought, this is the wisdom of anatta, the non-self. A letting go not just of things or people or moments, but of the illusion that you are a fixed, separate, grasping self. When that illusion falls away, what remains isn't emptiness, it's vastness, a spacious, boundless awareness where love is no longer a transaction, where loss no longer defines you, where each moment is enough exactly as it arrives. And here's the beautiful truth we often forget. You don't have to be a monk to taste this freedom. You don't have to live on a mountain, renounce all you own, or walk away from those you love. You only need to soften your grip, to wake each morning and remind yourself, I will hold nothing too tightly today. And when you forget, as we all do, you forgive yourself. You begin again. This is the quiet, unseen miracle of letting go. Not a grand, final release, but 1,000 tiny surrenders, 1,000 moments of grace. So as you close this chapter, take one last breath with me. Inhale. Feel the weight you no longer have to carry. Exhale, and watch it drift away. You're not losing anything. You're remembering who you've always been beneath it all. a being made of light, of breath, of open sky. And as the Buddha taught, let go of what has gone, let go of what may come, let go of what is happening now. Don't try to figure anything out. Don't try to make anything happen. Relax right now and rest, because beyond all your clinging and craving is the freedom you were born for.